Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. I'm Ruth Shelley, President of the Rotary Club of Portland. Welcome to our live weekly membership meeting. I just returned from a 5,200-mile road trip to Wisconsin, and in my mail, upon return, was this card from the Lake Oswego Club with this year's theme, Rotary Opens Opportunities. Yes, Rotary opens opportunities to find solutions for today's challenges, healing from the pandemic, recovery from the economic downturn, and peace building as we seek racial justice. On that road trip, I saw lots of windmills from all the way across Oregon and especially Wyoming and Nebraska and Iowa. And so I'm especially excited that this week we focus on door number 2, economic recovery, as fellow Rotarian Jack Kerfoot talks to us about alternative energy potential in Oregon. But first, let's welcome Rotarian Dick Wingard for our reflection. Dick?
When you look at the renewable energy in Oregon, I would suggest you look at the legacy of former Governor Tom McCall. Thomas Lawson McCall, son of a Massachusetts aristocrat, was the fourth force that overcame environmental inertia in this state. Perhaps the most famous environmental legislation enacted while he was the state's chief executive was the 91 bottle mill bill, the nation's first bottle deposit law that was designed to reduce litter in Oregon. But it is really a renewable energy bill because it replaces the manufacture of glass and aluminum cans with the reuse of the resources from which they are originally manufactured. You can have a technical debate about the efficiency of remanufacturing glass, but I would submit that it is insane to throw away aluminum cans, aluminum being element 13 on the periodic table. Stuff lasts forever. Tom McCall was for renewability before it had a name, but it has, among others, a family name. Tom's son, Tad McCall, lives in Virginia and is program manager for the Texas A&M Institute of Renewable Natural Resources, a renewable chip off the old block.
Thank you, Dick. A very timely reflection. Now I would like to ask that Rotarians who have invited a guest to raise their real or virtual hand, and Mike will call on you to unmute and introduce them. Or if you're a visiting Rotarian who came on your own, please raise your hand and introduce yourself, or let us know of your presence via the chat box. Welcome, and thank you all for attending our meeting. Do we see any guests, Mike? I think we're all
I'm not seeing any. If I'm missing you, go ahead and unmute yourself and say hello.
Okay.
In the chat.
We appreciate that. Thank you all members for attending our meeting. And it's January. I'd like to extend a happy birthday to everyone with birthdays this month. We alternate each week honoring birthdays and Rotary anniversaries. Please note the birthdays that Siobhan will show here and reach out to our fellow Rotarians with many happy returns. As Lucille Ball said, the key to a long life is to live honestly, eat slowly, and lie about your age. Happy birthday all. Now I want to give a Zoom update. We're all learning how to use it, and to make Zoom more accessible to our members, we have turned on closed captioning, which you'll see active here. Now, if you want to turn the closed captioning off, just click the live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen and click Hide Subtitle. You can change the size of the font, click the same icon, and then click Subtitle Settings. If you're having issues, please contact Siobhan after the meeting. And note that the transcript is imperfect, might be sometimes humorous, but we're hoping that it will be helpful. And now, please welcome President-elect Reed Miller for an update on our trust drive. Reed?
Thank you, President Ruth. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. The update on our trust drive, things are going very well. We have a goal of about $180,000 that we hope to raise this year for the trust drive. And I remind everybody, this is the one time of the year that we do fundraise for all of our committees that do the wonderful work out in the community. Of our $180,000 goal, we have pledges of $121,510. So we're about $60,000 short, but there is good news. The good news is our participation is a little bit low right now. I say that's good news because of all the possibility for you all to get out there and donate and bring us closer to our goal. And I remind you that this trust drive will run through the end of this month. We have just under 2 weeks left to get those pledges in. So I urge you all to check that off your to-do list, get in there and donate to a wonderful cause. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reed, for your leadership of the Trust Drive. And remember, the end of January will be here before we know it. And now, please welcome Rotarian Jim Flood to tell you about our Committee of the Month, Wheels of Power. Jim?
Thank you very much, President Ruth. And I'm going to warn people ahead of time that I have a little bit of unstable internet connection. And in case I blank out, Scott's volunteered to jump in for me, Scott Lofton. Wheels of Power was established by Ken Bement about 40 years ago. So far, we have given away over 1,000 mobile devices, and it has cost the Trust Board a little over $2 million to provide this needed transportation for people in our community. I would invite my fellow Rotarians to help participate in our committee if they see someone or find someone who may be in a situation where financially or from their insurance would not be able to afford a mobile device, to approach them and actually talk to them about the Wheels of Power in their Rotary Club. And they could even further champion that cause by not only bringing them to our attention, but also joining us on the committee for the interview, assuming we are able to do that in the future rather than just going by phone. And that's a great way for us on the Wheels of Power Committee to hopefully even interest other members of our club in one of its premier committees. Back to you, President Ruth.
Thank you, Jim. On my trip back to Wisconsin, I visited my brother who has MS and who is confined to a power chair. I can't tell you what a game changer these Wheels of Power are. Please think about who you know to make recommendations of recipients. And as Jim said, reach out to other Rotarians to see whom they might know so that we can bring this gift of mobility to more people. Now we're going to disappear and enter a virtual table talk. Please introduce yourself to others in your group. A minute or so before you come back to this main meeting, you'll get a visual heads up. And may I suggest a topic for your discussion? As we're on the eve of a presidential inauguration, perhaps you'd like to discuss your hopes for the new presidential administration. Here we go. Now on to our program. After our speaker today is finished, if you'd like to ask Jack a question, Mike will moderate the Q&A through the chat box. And now, please welcome past President Rotarian Scott Burns as today's chair of the day. Scott?
Thank you very much, President Ruth, and welcome to everybody else on this very, very significant day, the day before the inauguration. And I get to introduce Jack Kerfoot today, and he knows a wee bit about energy potential. He's been a member of our club for the last couple of years. I got a chance to know him on the Preserve Planet Earth committee. He talked to us back in July about energy. He's the owner of J.L. Kerfoot Energy Service. He's a scientist, but also an expert in the whole area of energy, and that's why we asked him to talk today. Now, he grew up in energy capital in the United States in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was a big place for oil. He joined he went to Vietnam. He served in the 101st Airborne, and then he came back. He went to the University of Oklahoma, got a bachelor's degree in geophysics, so he's kind of related to what I do. And then from there, he got a job with Mobil in Denver, Colorado. And that took him off all around the world. He worked for oil industry people and then energy people for a long time. He worked in Australia, Canada, England, Indonesia, Malaysia, Oman, Netherlands, Turkey, but at the same time, he's been an advocate for renewables. If you read his website, he has a lot of blogs on that. Also, he wrote a book called Fueling America, Insider's View to Energy. He's been interviewed all over the world, and I'm sure he'll mention a couple of those interviews today. So I would like to introduce Jack Kerfoot, who's going to be talking about Oregon's renewable energy potential. Welcome, Jack.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will start with my PowerPoint presentation. Energy in Oregon, past potential barriers and the path forward to increasing renewable energy. I'm going to start first by reminding us that 100 years ago, coal miners used canaries in the cage to warn of potential danger of air quality, toxic air quality. And today we have signs that are equally undeniable of the melting ice caps, relentless wildfires, catastrophic weather, and record high temperatures. And the clock is ticking. And we may see legislation that says states may be 100% renewable in 20, 30, or in some cases 40 years, but that clock is ticking much faster than that. So it's imperative that we take action today to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If we talk about energy in the past, the first slide I'm going to use, actually this is looking at electricity usage in Oregon from 1960 to 2018 from the U.S. Energy Information Agency. The units are in trillion BTUs, and what we see is a dramatic ramp up and increase in electrical consumption in Oregon this period of time. And on the right graph is the population. So what we actually see is that this dramatic increase in power is not directly related to the growing population in Oregon. It's associated with several factors. First of all, in the 1960s, power was very inexpensive, about a penny per kilowatt hour. Today, it's about 11 cents per kilowatt hour. Two, we started to see in the United States, and obviously in Oregon, an increase in the use of electric appliances. And also we saw a conversion from heating from natural gas or wood into electric as well. Now in the last, from 2005 to 2018, we see a ramp up here. And this is, we start to see the development of industries such as data storage facilities, and those are big consumers of power. The next is actually a breakdown of renewable power by the fuel type. So what we see in the yellow bars here is hydro. What we see is that in the 1960s and 70s, 100% of our power was from hydroelectricity. We see then the development of nuclear and obviously coal in the dark blue to the left, and we see that ramps up. And we start to see in the 90s a ramp up in natural gas, and starting in around 2005, other renewables, which includes wind and solar and geothermal. It's important to recognize that the actual decline in power from hydro. Why is that? Well, there's two reasons. First of all, when they manage the dams, they have to consider the marine life, the salmon in the streams and in the reservoirs. But the other real dominant factor is if we look back over the last 20 and 30 years, we've seen a repeated decline in precipitation. And as a result, the actual power outage from the dams has steadily decreased. Now, if we look at 2018, what we're actually seeing is that this is Oregon Department of Energy, 49% of our power was from renewables. So in the 1960s and 70s, we've gone from 100% to today, 49%. Most of that's still hydro, onshore wind, and then minor amounts of solar and biomass, geothermal. And then we look at fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, petroleum, and finally in 2018, there was about 4% from nuclear. So we're seeing a change in our lifetime. So energy potential in the state, this is a National Renewable Energy Laboratory map that measures wind speed in meters per second. And what you need to recognize is dark blue means very strong and consistent winds. Wind speed is very important. The difference between a 14-mile-an-hour wind and a 16-mile-an-hour wind to a wind turbine today is a power output difference of double. Now, if we actually look, the area with the darkest blue is actually off Oregon. And what we actually find is these are not just the strongest winds in Oregon. These are the strongest winds in the entire United States compared to the East Coast, the Gulf Coast. Now, what kind of undeveloped wind potential do we have? Well, 27,000 megawatts, which represents over 200% of our power consumed in Oregon in 2018. Offshore, 225 gigawatts. That's almost 2,000% of our power. That's why you see major offshore wind projects being developed along the east coast of the US, and it's been developed in Europe for over 20, 25 years, and is now currently being developed in places like offshore China, Taiwan, Japan. Now, let's take a look at solar. People in Portland seldom think about the solar potential, but actually, when we look at solar, we need to recognize that in the fall and the winter, because of the shorter daylight hours, the amount of radiant heat, the increase in radiant heat is red, and the cooler areas are in greens and blues and purples. This area is less in the winter than it is in the summer and spring, and that's understandable. But we actually do have significant renewable energy from solar, particularly in the eastern and southern part of the state, which would generate about 17% of our total power. And actually, we look at the reference, again, from the DOE, they're referencing technology that was over 10 years old. And the power output capacity from solar panels today is about 35 to 40% higher than when this study was done. But what I've tried to do is develop the more conservative estimate in the resource potential for our state. This is geothermal. Geothermal, when we talk about that, the largest geothermal project in the world actually is in Northern California, north of Santa Rosa and near a town called Cloverdale. And it was developed in the 1960s. And when I worked on it when I was university, a summer job in the 70s, it was actually generating about 80% of the electrical power in the entire Bay Area. And what they actually do is they drill into the granite or into the igneous rock, into the fractures. Water comes up, which is steam, that turns the turbines, and then they re-inject it. So those geothermal projects are still operating today. And how much potential do we have? According to DOE, it would generate about 30%. If you look at the United States Geological Survey, they would estimate the amount of renewable energy that we have from geothermal is over 4,000 megawatts. So again, I've taken a conservative estimate. Now, when we look at any type of resource assessment, regardless of the resource, whether it's timber or minerals, natural gas, or renewable energy like wind, we typically will develop resource maps. The first thing we have to recognize, this actually shows where the major dams or hydro projects are in our state. And we're recognizing that these dams were started to be developed in the late 30s. This tells you where our grid primarily is. Now let's look at where the solar fairway is inside the yellow. And then where the major onshore wind fairway is, again in eastern Oregon. And then of course, geothermal and offshore wind. So what it tells you is where our grid was developed starting 30s and 40s through the 70s is not where renewable energy is. And that's shouldn't be a surprise. You see that time and time again. Now, what it tells you with my spinning wheel here is we have enough renewable energy to generate well over 2,000% of our power just from renewable energy. Okay, but we've got vast quantities, but who's going to buy it? And how do we get it there? We can't exactly put it in an envelope and ship it down to other states. But what we can use is the existing infrastructure, the major intertie lines that were developed in the 1970s. And the concept was in the 1970s that the power line that goes from Bonneville down to Southern California, the Los Angeles area, was that in the summer when Los Angeles needs the power, Oregon can ship the hydropower down to Southern California. And in the winter, in theory, California could ship that power to the north. But the actual fact is there is more capacity on that, and the demand for power in our state, as well as California, is increasing. But these are major power lines. Now let's take a look at who would buy it. Well, California, we have to recognize that they are the largest state in population, about 39 million people. And two, they've enacted legislation that mandates in 2035, all new cars be electric. And 2045, all new trucks, vans, and buses be electric. And by 2045, all electrical systems, all power generated, all electrical power, be from renewable energy. Well, first let's recognize that the power from an electric vehicle is the equivalent of about 70% as much power as a typical home. So when you're talking about adding automobiles and trucks and buses to the grid, that says you've got a dramatic increase. Where is California today in renewables? About 36%. 36%, and they want to be 100%. So they're going to need more help to import more renewable energy from the state, like Oregon. They're already doing that from Oregon already, but also Nevada and other states as well. So we have to recognize when we talk about renewable energy, I occasionally in some of the radio programs get some pushback. The first is, well, this has never worked. We've never done this before. Actually, we have. In 1890, coal passed wood. And in the 1890s, as the coal mines were developed, the energy hubs at the time were Kentucky and West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And then in the 1950s, oil passed coal primarily because of the automobile. So states like Oklahoma and Texas became the renewable or the energy hubs at the time for fossil fuels. And now we're starting to move to renewable energy. It's already passed coal. And in 2005, coal generated 51% of our electrical power. Today it's 22%, and projected to be less than 10% by 2030. So new renewable energies are being developed, and Oregon has the potential to be one. We have wind, we have hydropower, we have solar, and we have geothermal. We have significant renewable energy that could generate our power needs today and into the future and to other states. Major transmission lines are in place. What kind of jobs? Now, using DOE data, there's a typical rule of thumb that they say that for every gigawatt of power, every 1,000 megawatts of a wind farm or solar park generates about 135 permanent jobs just on those plants. Well, that's 33,000 jobs in Oregon on the wind and the solar and the geothermal. And that's actually a conservative number. Now, on construction jobs, using the same resource, over 1 million construction jobs in the state of Oregon building these facilities. As we try and rebound from the devastation of COVID and our economy being one of the factors, think what this could do to our economy. Barriers. Now, this to me is sort of the highlight slide to point out potential problems. This is a 12-month snapshot of major utility projects. Wind is green and solar is yellow. That are coming online between June of last year through May of this year at the height of COVID. So the first thing you should notice is look at the amount of projects that are going on down in Texas and Oklahoma, up in South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, the solar projects in Minnesota, major solar developments in North Carolina. And I would point out the solar potential in Oregon is actually greater than North Carolina. And North Carolina is the second state with the second amount of solar power generation in the US, and also Florida, of course. Now compare that to Oregon, and actually this should be a green and a yellow. This is a hybrid project PGE just brought on, where they have wind turbines and solar. But the volume, considering the capacity of renewable energy resource potential we have compared to what we're developing, that highlights the barriers that exist. And intentionally, on the right side, what you see is, although these will not be on producing by May of 2021, these are the major offshore wind projects that are being developed off the east coast of the US. Now, let's take a look at our power grid. Now, this map actually is interesting because the green area represents the Bonneville Power Authority. And the dark green lines represent your high volume transmission lines. So all those dams that we have in Washington, Oregon are operated by Bonneville and are hooked into the grid that was developed in the 30s, the 40s, through the 70s. Now, Bonneville actually covers over 300,000 square miles: Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Nevada, Utah, and California. So it is like another area by comparison is the Tennessee Valley Authority relative to a major source of power generation. They operate 31 federal dams. They also have nuclear, coal, and natural gas. They operate over 75% of our high voltage transmission lines. They generate between 28 and 40% of Oregon's power at any point in time. The private utilities, PGE, Pacificorp, and Idaho Power, basically are developing single small little projects and trying to tie into the grid depending on the power capacity that BPA has. They're not building the major transmission line because of the economics. To do that, you need major power sources. You would need to develop our major renewable energy resources. Also, permitting in Oregon is difficult and challenging. So we have a sparse grid in the areas where we have all the renewable energy, where we have the solar and the wind with very little grid access. And then we get over here to the offshore area. Well, of course, we have nothing at this time. So let's take a look at the barriers. Well, transmission line designed for a hydropower system. Last time we really had any major upgrades was in the 70s. Permitting cycle time, and I think this is perhaps the most illuminating relative to the challenges in Oregon. Texas is 12 to 18 months. That includes federal and state as well, environmental protection agencies, the whole site permitting process. They have a streamlined process and they can tell anybody that wants to build a power project where areas that they can build it and go through and give them basically very clear specifications on the requirements. And once they meet that, then the cycle time for approval is very short. That's the reason they are the largest generator of renewable energy power in megawatt hours of any state in the United States. New Jersey. Now, the interesting thing is, over 2 years ago, a new governor came in and he wanted to encourage the development of renewable energy. So they streamlined the permitting processes for offshore. Offshore wind, it's not just, even if you're building it in federal waters, it's not just the federal permits. You've got to build that power line through the beach area, and getting permits through the beach and transition areas is a very complex and sometimes challenging experience. They've shortened their cycle time from 5 to 7 years to 2 to 3 years. And as a result, they're now becoming the offshore energy hub for the area from Maine down to Maryland, which is obviously significant jobs as well. Oregon cycle time, 6 to 20 years. Many projects are canceled. I had one example from a landman at PGE. It took him over 20 years to get a 17-mile transmission line from a small power project to tie in to the BPA grid. Land access, we have BPA, which has their own permits and processes, which can be very time consuming. We also have, in some counties in Oregon, opposition to solar. Some areas believe that areas with high agricultural potential should ban, or actually have banned, the use of solar. However, the EPA has published many reports on the advantages of developing agricultural land with solar. It's called agrivoltaics. And what you actually see is, with these type of approaches, increase in pollination, because an increase in the bee and butterfly populations, which help pollinate the crops in the area. So it is, unfortunately, an outdated concept. Also, the 1973 Land Conservation and Development Act has many strong advantages, but they also have create opportunities for anyone that says, well, I don't want a wind turbine 200 miles or 100 miles because I drive by it every now and again. And unfortunately, we have that to put up restrictions and barriers to that. Now, we have limited utility company competition. We've got to recognize you've got PGE that's focused on the northwest part of the state, and we have Pacific Corp in the southwest, and we have Idaho Power in the east. And in the middle, we have this very large Bonneville Power Authority with a very bureaucratic and systematic approach toward the processes to tie into their grid. What's the path forward? Well, first, complete an Oregon renewable energy transmission and storage study. That is an example I would use is the state of New Mexico. About 3 years ago, the legislators developed a bipartisan agreement. They wanted to develop the renewable energy of the state and wanted to put targets there. But the first question, which is absolutely the question to ask, what's the resource potential of our state? They did this study and they found they had several hundred, almost 1,000 times the amount of renewable energy. And they said, well, okay, where is our grid? And what they found out is just like Oregon, where the renewable resources are not where the grid. And then they recognized the job opportunities, the economic benefit of moving from high cost fossil fuels to renewable energy and the export potential to other states. And so they are now actively moving forward to develop the grid for export of renewable energy for other states and to achieve their targeted goal of being 100% renewable energy by 2035. Initiate renewable energy tenders. This has been done in the state of Maine. They decided they had a RPS or renewable portfolio standard to be 100% renewable energy by 2040. But the governor asked the question, what are the barriers that are keeping us from achieving that? And they recognized the barriers were not there. So the actual state of Maine stepped in and said, we're going to bring the utilities in our state together and we're going to develop a tender. Because if we get a larger volume of projects, that will draw more attention, more companies and more resources. So in a very short period of time, they developed a tender. They held the tender. 60 days later, they made the award, 540 megawatts of wind and solar projects. The different utilities divvied up the projects, and the average cost of that tender was 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. The average cost of power, residential power in Oregon is about 11 cents. The average cost of power in the United States is about 13.4, 13.5 cents. Tax credits for renewable projects, particularly for the offshore area, that's been done in some states to jumpstart it because initially the capital expenditure on the first wind farms can be very expensive. And so that gets that going. And then once it gets going, you start to see the cost drop. In the East Coast, the first cost for wind farms, the power purchase agreements were 7.5 cents per kilowatt hour. The second one that came in last year was 6.5 cents. And a one that is now being reported for New Jersey is about 5.5 cents per kilowatt hour. These generate, the winds are always stronger offshore than onshore. So the economics for offshore wind are clearly there. Expedite intertie transmission line capacity, expand, excuse me. That's something that I hope that we can work with our state legislators at the Senate and the congressmen to talk about as part of the infrastructure development that President-elect Biden has been mentioning, that this could be one of the projects. Develop world-class renewable energy apprenticeship programs. The United States has never held an apprenticeship program with the same esteem or emphasis as what I saw in Europe and the Netherlands and the UK. And I worked with many groups to develop apprenticeship programs in the Netherlands and with the labor unions to achieve that. One of the critical shortages of development of renewable energy is actually people that can operate the wind turbines and also work on the solar projects as well. All right, conclusions. Well, it isn't a question of potential. It's really the question of how do we unlock that potential, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, develop new clean green energy industry in Oregon, develop world-class renewable energy apprenticeship program, 33,000 permanent jobs, which will also, as we develop these resources, will cause our power costs to actually decline, and over 1 million construction jobs. The final thoughts, although some of my words may sound perhaps a little negative, I would refer you to an OPB article, Broken Promises, Cascadia Region on Track to Cut Carbon Emissions, Not on Track, by Peter Fairley in January of this year. And actually what he talks about is British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon have talked about being green, but actually over the last 15, 20 years, their emissions have steadily increased. So we, as the region, are not walking the talk. And one last thing I'd like to do, the concept of global warming and renewable energy can sometimes be abstract. But if I can get technology to work, we'll see if I can get this very short YouTube video perhaps to be a bit more meaningful as far as what global warming means. This is major wildfires between 1910 and 2019, and I'm going to fast forward a little because what this is showing on the left-hand table is the 10 largest wildfires, and this shows the brighter the area shows the intensity.
Jack, unfortunately, your link isn't showing, and we need to wrap up in about a minute, please.
All right, well then if it's not showing, then I will simply try and stop this and we'll get this to go. All right, once again.
Thank
All right,
you
so
so much
my
for,
final comment is, when are we going to really address climate change? So that's the presentation, and thank you.
thank you, and what a quick pivot. I am so glad that you got your technology to work because it was a fascinating presentation. We have time for 2 questions, and Al, I noted that you had one in the chat. If you could ask your question, and then if anybody else has a question, please put it in the chat and we will have Mike call on you. Al?
Yeah, thank you, Ruth and Jack. Very, very informative. Hydro is been seen by all of us Oregonians as the ultimate green. But I'm hearing now that because of global warming, reservoirs are warming up and becoming with algae and stuff in them. And that when the water goes over the spillways, methane is released. In fact, a lot of methane. Of course, that's worse than CO2. So is hydro as green as we want to believe?
Well, that's an interesting point because what it highlights is a new element of technology. When I've asked BPA about this, they thought I was speaking a foreign language. Floating solar has been used by countries like in China, Brazil, areas that have high quantities of hydropower. And what they're doing is putting the floating solar panels. And not only does that generate additional power, what it also does is mitigate the evaporation and also mitigate the heating from that standpoint. So you mitigate the risk of that type of algae growth and algae generation, and you increase the power as well. So that's what other countries are using. Other areas in the United States are using that as well. Just BPA has not quite picked this up.
And Angel, did you have a question for Jack?
I just put it in the chat. Have you given this presentation to the lawmakers, the governor, et cetera, because it's so informative and could be so helpful, especially when it focuses on jobs? They might be interested in that.
Well, I'd agree. The renewable group that I'm with, the nonprofit that I'm with, that's one of the Engineers for Sustainable Future are actually working. They helped me peer review this, that I put this together. And we plan to take this out to try and have presentations at the federal and at the state level to raise awareness and help people understand ways to really make positive change for our environment and for our state.
Well, I hope you get that opportunity, Jack. I'm so sorry that we'll have to close questions here, but knowing that Jack is a fellow Rotarian, if you have a question, I'm sure you could email him directly and he'd be happy to answer. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Next week, we'll hear from Brady Swenson, Head of Education at Swan Bitcoin and the host of the Citizen Bitcoin podcast. He'll be presenting on the cryptocurrency Bitcoin, what it is, the history of Bitcoin, and how it has become to what it is today. Another fascinating, totally different presentation, but equally relevant as Jack's message was today. And this meeting will once again be live via Zoom at noon on Tuesday. Now, as we close, Dick, thank you for your very relevant reflection. And Jim, thank you for your insight into our Wheels of Power Committee. Scott, we appreciated your speaker introduction. And again, Jack, thank you for opening our eyes to Oregon's energy potential. I think that's what really struck me, is the untapped potential of our state in terms of alternative energy. Finally, I'd like to thank our President-elect Reed Miller for running the meeting last week when I was on the road and for running the trust drive. Thanks to everyone who has already contributed, and thanks in advance to those of you who I know will contribute before the end of the month. As we enter into a new Rotary week, please join me in opening the doors of opportunity for healing, for recovery, and peace building. As Rotarians, we're here to make our world healthier, more sustainable, and with justice for all. This meeting is adjourned. Have a great week, everyone, and goodbye.